because of the Every Student Succeeds Act, but it's also really an opportunity for us to reflect on where we are in DC education and what our city needs going forward. As you know, we've made tremendous progress, but there are also still tremendous gaps for some of our students. And so thinking about how we can accelerate the progress for those students who are far behind is one of the opportunities that we have under the development of the plan through ESSA. The Every Student Succeeds Act was passed in December of 2015, and draft regulations on accountability were issued in spring of 2016, and the department has been putting out draft regulations on several areas related to the Every Student Succeeds Act, but the final version of those regulations are not yet finalized. And so we are moving forward with development, but obviously there will still be final regulations to come where there could be some changes. And as part of the department's draft regulations, they proposed 2 deadlines for states to submit plans, which have to include their approach to accountability. And the 2 actions proposed were March and July, or July of 2017. And we are currently aiming for the March 2017 submission deadline, barring any timeline changes from ED or unforeseen circumstances. And we're doing that because we've heard feedback from you and from school leaders about the importance of knowing the path forward prior to the beginning of the school year. And so given the time period that ED has for review, if we submit it in July, we may not hear back prior to the beginning of the school year. And it's important to note the distinction between the formal accountability system and the school report card. And so when we're talking about measures, they could apply to either one of those things, but there's different timelines with those 2 products. So the formal accountability system, the system that's used to classify schools, is part of our submission that's going in March of 2017. The school report card, which provides us with an additional opportunity for transparency around additional data elements that may go beyond what's included in our formal accountability system, isn't issued for the first time until December of 2018. And so we have additional time following the deadline for our state plan to think further about that. And so we are planning to really focus in the short term on that formal accountability system development. Obviously, as some of you may have seen in our measure survey and in the conversations we've had to date, we're very much gathering feedback on the report card because these things are very closely intertwined, but wanted to be very clear about sort of when we expect to deliver final versions of those 2 products, because we do have time into 2017 to think further about the report card. And so as we think about the formal accountability system, our approach in DC is really about coming to having a common system. So as many of you may know, right now, there are many places that parents have to go for information. They are finding information from the existing state plan for accountability, as well as from the public charter schools performance management framework, from DCPS's 40/40 scorecard, and they're also finding other information on schools through equity reports and other sources. And so this system really offers us an opportunity to have common information for parents and for the public, and to accelerate and deepen our progress in DC education. Moreover, it provides us with a chance to have a common definition of schools that are doing well, so that we can celebrate and learn from those schools and more readily identify which schools are struggling and need more resources and supports to improve across both sectors. So this is really an opportunity for greater collaboration, learning, and clarity across all of the schools in DC. So I just wanted to provide that context before we get a little bit into the weeds. So from our prior conversations in April and in July, we've heard from folks that sort of seeing something holistic that presents a full framework would be helpful. And we thought, particularly as we dive into more data modeling, that hearing some feedback on this framework would help to inform our work there. So what you're going to see this afternoon are two frameworks, one for elementary and middle school and one for high school. And it's informed from the conversations that we've had to date with you and with other stakeholders. It's informed by the responses that we've received back to date on the measure survey and the vision survey. And it's also informed from some research that we've heard going on nationally. What it includes, and we'll go ahead and pull it up now, it includes some possible indicators within the required domains, and again, draft overall weights for those domains. It does not, at this point, contemplate weights for individual indicators, and it also doesn't contemplate things like floors or targets or what someone may need to do to get certain numbers of points. Those are things that we will obviously come back and have additional conversations about, but they aren't included here because, frankly, additional data modeling is needed to be able to have thoughtful conversations. So we're going to take everyone off mute now so that as I'm talking and sharing some of the feedback that we've heard so far, you all have an opportunity to pipe in, and we'll just change that if there's too much sort of background noise on any of your lines. So first, just in looking at this elementary and middle accountability framework, I wanted to point out that the four sort of dark blue lines that you see here are the four domains that are set out in the regulations as required domains for the elementary and middle school framework. So that is academic achievement, academic progress, progress in achieving English language proficiency, and school quality and student success. So those are four required domains. And then within those domains, we have some flexibility about how we might approach what's included. And so to start first, the academic achievement domain. What we selected here was based largely on the feedback that we received from the measures survey, where we heard the most interest in including an indicator that reviewed how many students were scoring at the 4 or above level. And obviously, since this includes both PARCC and MSAA, or alternate assessment, it would mean 3+ for MSAA because we know the scales there are different. On the measure survey, we also heard nearly as much interest including 3+, and some of the feedback there was around the additional opportunity for differentiation. And then we also heard almost the same amount of interest for something around reducing students at the lower levels. And during the conversation with folks last week, we heard some of the same feedback, but in addition, I would share that we heard this idea of the value of sort of focusing on the aspirational, and that, you know, a real focus on 4+ and maybe 3+ may be more appropriate, and that growth as the category below that we'll talk about in just a moment may sufficiently get at sort of the same concept of % reduction in students at levels 1 and 2. We also heard comments that since schools are striving for that bar of 4 and above, that the accountability system should really match that aspiration and incentivize schools to work with students to get to that level. And I'll pause there before I continue on and just see if anyone has any questions or comments on the academic achievement domain.
And just as a technology note, it looks like some people have muted themselves, maybe because there's a lot of background noise, so thank you for doing that. If you also want to put a question into the question box, we can also handle questions that way.
Great. One of the other pieces of feedback we heard was the potential of the system evolving over time, and that if we were to include something like 3 and above, that after a park has been in place for several years and our score distributions may look different, that we could change the weight over time. And I think that comment was interesting because I think it just reminds all of us that this system based on our accountability principles is going to be the best system that we can put forward at this point in time, but that a commitment to continuous improvement is something that we all agree to as part of the design principles for the system. And so I'm going to skip over subgroup performance because we're going to come back to that as sort of a separate conversation, and instead go ahead on to academic progress. And here, some of the conversation was actually around the relationship between academic achievement and academic progress. We heard feedback on how the weighting of those two being similar was helpful, and how also just the inclusion of academic progress in the elementary and middle school framework was important. As many of you may know, the current state education agency accountability system actually doesn't look at growth over time. So this is aligned with the weighting that's currently seen in the performance management framework in terms of the equal amounts for academic achievement and academic progress. We also heard some feedback on the type of growth measure that we might want to consider, and the importance of thinking about a growth measure that works well now, as well as when we would improve over time, and thinking about how we reward both high performance and high growth. And here, growth was represented as measured by median growth percentile or other growth measures, and we shared that ASSE is currently working with an independent researcher to evaluate our historical assessment data, our historical growth modeling around median growth percentile, and also to investigate other possible growth models that we may want to consider in DC's specific context. And this applies a little bit as well when we get into the high school framework, but thus far, based on the progression of how students take high school, park, and our end size, being able to have growth at the high school level has been difficult. And so we wanted someone who could not just tell us, sort of about what's possible with growth models hypothetically, but who really could look at our specific DC data and share with us both the pros and cons of different models and key questions and trade-offs to keep in mind. So as part of that research, we're looking at both our underlying student data, the data that has been generated by Tembo, our vendor that has been working with us to date, as well as the calculations that were conducted this year by Pearson, the vendor who works with us on Park, who produced student growth percentiles for both DC as the norm group and with the national norm group. And so SGPs are what are underlying median growth percentile. Those roll up to school totals. And so our research right now is looking at all of those possible options. And we're just going to take a moment here. The external partner who is looking at growth models is Calder. And Josh, if you have other questions, I'm happy to answer them as well after today's presentation. But that's who we are working with on that independent research. Great. So to continue on into the next category within, I think we accidentally moved into high school. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that, folks. To move into the English language proficiency category, as you may know, Title III used to be where English language proficiency accountability lived. And now under ESSA, those provisions related to accountability for English language proficiency are now in Title I and integrated into our whole state accountability plan. And so this is really an interesting area, not just for DC, but nationally, because everyone has been following what were called AMAOs for looking at English language proficiency. And this wasn't an area where states had flexibility under ESEA waivers to think of new options. And so right now is really the first time that folks are looking as to how we might be able to get at English proficiency in a different way. And so survey respondents were really interested in all of the options that we laid out on a fairly equal level, with slightly less interest in the portfolio option, but interest in looking at both growth and proficiency of students on the Access for ELs 2.0, which is aligned with the WIDA consortia. And yesterday, I should note that there was another focus group related to ELs, and we heard some feedback, more feedback there, I would say, than actually in the meeting last week. And the key pieces of feedback we heard related to the overall weight of this domain, as well as to the related question about N sizes, which you'll see is, one of the big things we'll have to consider for the system overall. Because an N size that we might select for English language learners would not just impact that group, but it would also impact every subgroup. So we can't pick a different N size for one group than another. It has to be consistent. But we can choose to have one N size for accountability and a different N size for reporting. That is one of our opportunities, and we'll be thinking about N size in conjunction with other suppression rules. So I understand we have a question.
So there's a question about, not about English language proficiency, but about pre-K through second grade measures and how we're considering looking at those measures at this point in time.
Yeah, so we are considering looking at pre-K through 2 measures. They are not contemplated here because it's something that we are still in the process of considering, both given measures that are currently available as well as measures that may be available over time. And so that's something that we plan to follow up further on in a future session. But I'm curious if the person who asked that question, if you have any particular thoughts or ideas for us to keep in mind, it would be great to hear from you. Okay, but yes, that's certainly still on the table. One of the things that we have said, and I was going to mention this when we got to the high school framework, is that in the short term for the plan that we deliver by next year, we aren't planning to include an adult framework, but we are planning to address alternative schools. And again, you'll see that that isn't laid out in detail here, again, because of the importance of definitionally getting very clear about who that kind of framework would apply to. And so that's another area that we'll be circling back on in the future. So before I move on to school quality and student success, I wanted to share that one of the other comments that was raised in our session last week was the use of Access for ELs 2.0 for this purpose. As many of you may know, sort of WIDA as a consortium designed this test not necessarily to be used in this way, and so, ASSE is committed to following up with WIDA about its position for using Access for ELs in accountability under ESSA. We've certainly heard from other states anecdotally that that's their plan, but we did commit to looking into that further. So it's something you can expect to hear back from us on. I'm going to pivot at this point to school quality and student success, but of course at any time we can go back if it's helpful. And so the goal of this domain is important to remind us of because it is something really specific in the regulations. And as we're thinking about it, one of our goals is really ensuring that this domain provides additional differentiation on our overall framework, and that it provides information that we don't just get from academic measures in the first 2 domains above. it's an opportunity for us to have additional transparency and to learn more about how schools are serving students. And in our measure survey, there was strong interest in including some sort of measure of attendance and including some sort of measure around re-enrollment. So that's the large reason why we included both of those in the particular draft framework that you're seeing today. In using re-enrollment, we are aware that both the DCPS 4040 framework and the public charter school framework currently have measures of these, and that getting to the details of business rules around re-enrollment is critically important. A lot of the conversation around this measure, in particular during the session last week, focused on the importance of considering how this could impact schools with a transient population or schools that have military students or other factors that may not be reflections on the school itself. And so we are very much aware of the fact that this measure, like many other measures, would require consideration around business rules. And then in terms of attendance, we haven't said here what type of attendance measure, because I think that's an area we are certainly doing additional research on. As some of you know, there is in-seat attendance, there's average daily attendance, chronic absenteeism, and various other ways that we could look at an indicator around attendance. And so at one of our upcoming sessions on school quality and student success, we'll be digging into possible attendance metrics in more detail. But during the meeting last week, one of the pieces that we heard was the importance of framing this type of measure in an aspirational manner. So thinking about what we want schools to do rather than what we don't want them to do. And just overall that a framework that has some measures that you want to go up and some that you want to go down could be very confusing, and that we should think about the importance of all measures having the aim of going up for clarity to schools.
And we have a question about the school quality and student success area around what feedback we got on the measure survey on using suspension rates as they are presented in the equity report or maybe in other ways, and using that particular bucket of data in the accountability framework.
Yeah, so far from the responses to date, and off the top of my head, I'm believing that when we did the analysis for this meeting, we had just around 75 total respondents, but the responses by particular questions ranged, and so that survey is open through the end of the month, so I just wanted to plug that. We are still looking at it and reviewing new responses. Overall, discipline wasn't rated as highly as some of the other options for inclusion in the formal accountability framework, but there was interest in the inclusion of discipline as a potential public-facing metric for transparency. So as I mentioned before, there are some things that we're actually required to publicly report on that won't be in the formal system, and likewise, we could opt to include additional things in our public reporting that aren't in our formal system. And so the feedback we've received so far was not to have it in the formal system. Great. Okay, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn us to the high school framework. And we can obviously come back to the elementary, middle if necessary. And so here you'll see that we have additional domains beyond what we had in the elementary and middle school framework, and the addition here is on graduation rate because that is required for high school. For high school, we are not required to include a domain on academic progress, but you'll see that is proposed in the current draft framework. And so it's important to note here that in academic achievement, we received similar feedback to what we saw in elementary and middle school. And for both elementary and middle and high school, we also on our measure survey had science listed as an option. And I should mention that, you know, sort of as compared to interest in 4+, 3+ and reduction in levels 1 and 2 for ELA and math, very few respondents indicated interest in inclusion of science. And so we heard, comments on those responses that reflected the newness of the test, the timeline of release of results, and given sort of not having seen more information, that feeling hard to comment on this time. I'm not sure if any of you have sentiments on this, but feel free to write it in the comments if you have other thoughts on that as well. In terms of academic progress, we had, sort of folks that noted that growth is harder at the high school level, and also different at the high school level, where tests are, sort of subject-based. They're more truly course-based than grade-based, and that we might want to consider how we look at growth in a different way for high school. And in the conversation in person last week, there was sort of agreement on the concept of growth being important, but additional acknowledgement of the challenge for measuring growth at high school given the PARCC assessment course timing, which right now, as you may know, the required assessment for high school is geometry or integrated math 2, but there are some circumstances where students take a different course if they had taken that course prior to being in high school. And so we heard sort of different ends of comments on this as it related to sort of thinking about coverage of students in the framework overall, whether or not sort of the concept of what we included for high school is too narrow and not reflective enough of all students that attend high school, but we also heard that in some ways the high school framework actually covers more grade spans than we might in elementary and middle school. When you think about both the academic achievement, progress, graduation rate, and then school quality and student success measures. So we definitely heard a range of feedback here. We also heard some interest in SAT or ACT being considered, which you'll see right now was shown in the school quality and student success area as a potential additional high school measure. So we heard some comments as to whether or not it may make sense for that to be situated in the academic achievement bucket in addition to the PARCC exam. So I'm not sure if anyone on the line right now has thoughts about sort of where it may make sense for something like SAT to live, but feel free to write in the comments if you have something on that.
And we do also have a question in this area around whether OSSE is considering moving away from geometry and requiring students to take a different test as freshmen and sophomores.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that we heard similar comments last week. There was some talk about 9th grade. There was some talk about, possible assessments across more than one grade, and those are all things that OSSE is considering. And we will certainly be following up on that in more detail at a later time. One of the things that just since I mentioned briefly SAT, because it came up in the context of academic achievement, was how the system, this draft framework really orients itself around college readiness, and that we may want to also consider measures that would get at career readiness. So looking further at rigorous career certifications like formal CTE certifications that we have in place may make sense to factor into the system as well. And then in terms of the overall portion of the system that was weighted on academic achievement and academic progress, we heard some feedback that this may be a lot and that we may want to consider the domain weighting differently. So then in terms of graduation rate, as you may know, we are required to include 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate as part of our formal accountability system. And that's in addition to a trigger for any school that has a graduation rate that's under 67%. They are automatically identified in the comprehensive support category, which is comparable to the previous category of priority schools. So we are aware that that automatically is going to identify a portion of our high schools, but in the formal framework, we are given the opportunity to include additional measures. And so here we included two possible additional measures. One would be the 5-year cohort graduation rate, and then an additional one was a 4-year ACGR rate that looks at progress over time. And we heard during the session last week that there was really less interest in the progress, the 4-year progress measure, and that the 5-year ACGR did make sense, but that overall thinking about how schools kind of aren't double hit on graduation rate would be important for us to keep in mind as we think about domain weights overall. Any questions on graduation rate before I move on? Okay. And in terms of English language proficiency, we heard similar comments here as we did in the earlier framework. One of the points that was raised was sort of that language acquisition may be different for students at different grade levels, and that we may want to consider, these developmentally appropriate goals for students based on what grade level they're in. And so that's actually something we're looking at now to see if growth looks different at different grade levels in DC's data. We know that is the trend nationally, but we want to better understand DC's historical data and whether or not that premise holds true here. So in the school quality and student success category, on the measure survey, we similarly heard interest on attendance and re-enrollment. And then there were two additional sort of categories of measures that there was interest on that you'll see reflected here. One was what is called on track to graduate, which sort of relates to graduation rate in the sense that it would be looking at how students in 9th grade had acquired coursework that put them on track to then graduate within 4 years. And on this measure, during our discussion, we heard sort of the potential for this to have perverse incentives for high schools, and that it could lead to schools moving students on and or awarding credits in a way that actually wasn't consistent with a student's progress. And then in terms of the other high school measures for SAT, AP, IB, and dual enrollment, there was interest just in exploring how these measures may provide additional context on students' readiness to move on to college and careers successfully, and that there may be value in looking at participation and or achievement. So similar to attendance, this is a category that we will talk about in additional detail in our upcoming session on school quality and student success measures that's happening later this month. Any additional thoughts or questions on this particular domain in the high school framework or anything else that I've covered so far? Okay, great. And so I'm just going to turn now to the conversation that we had around subgroups. And so, as we're thinking about building an accountability system for DC, the ultimate hope is that this system will help us define where our good schools are, so that other schools know where those good schools are, and so that there's clarity with the public. And as part of thinking about what we believe a good school is, we believe that it's important to think about not only how it serves all of its students on average, but also how it serves particular groups of students. And as I mentioned at the beginning, while we've made tremendous progress as a state, we still lag behind many. And one of the areas where we still have challenges are in the significant gaps between different student groups that exist within the city. And so one of our challenges and also one of our opportunities under ESSA is to think about goals for specific groups of students that acknowledge where we are now without continuing the same pattern. And it's an area that we are eager to get feedback on from you and other stakeholders as we design our system. And so the questions that we contemplated are big ones and ones that I know you all may need additional time to process and digest, but I want to put them out to you with the hopes that if you do have thoughts after today's webinar, you shoot them to us so that we have an opportunity to think about them. So the three questions that we talked about were first, in 20 years, what would you want to be true about the progress of specific subgroups of students? And we use the term subgroups because that's what's in the regulations, but when we think of subgroups, we think about that in reference to specific groups of students. The second question is, we often talk about closing gaps, and we're curious, sort of when we talk about closing gaps, what gaps are we talking about closing? Which groups and relative to which other groups? And then the third question was, sort of how much should we be factoring in subgroups into our overall system? So we will have to think about weights, and how much should we think about weighing particular groups of students as compared to the overall student average? And this was a question on the survey, and we found that about half of respondents sort of fell into the camp of weighting subgroups somewhat, and then there was about equal interest in weighing them a lot or weighing them a little. And so we wanted to sort of get a sense as to whether or not people had similar feedback as what we heard in the measures survey. So to share a little bit about what we heard on this during the conversation last week, we heard that there's value in closing gaps both within schools and within the city, and that looking at how DC is doing as compared with other states is also important. We heard about the importance of balancing the needs of both homogeneous schools and diverse schools, so that however we approach specific groups of students in the weighting of our system doesn't unintentionally point to something other than how a school is serving those groups of students, that there could be unintended consequences about how points are distributed. We heard also that there's really a need for clarity on which types of populations are important in this framework and to prioritize those. So there are particular subgroups that we have to consider in the formal accountability framework, and then there are additional groups that have to be publicly reported, and those include foster, homeless, and military that are in that latter category of public reporting. And so we heard that just the volume of specific groups can be a lot of information, and that it could also lead to a lack of clarity and focus, and that presenting information on how specific groups of students are doing in a way that is digestible will be really important. And then we came back at this time also to the N size point, and that when we think about N size, we heard that there may be interest in lowering the N size so that we could get at more nuance and to drive further accountability, but that there's also drawbacks to that in thinking about at what point there's a sufficient number of students for schools to be accountable. And so we talked again about the opportunity for us to consider different N sizes for public reporting and for accountability potentially. We also heard that in thinking about how students are doing and closing gaps on these sort of state assessments are really only one part of making students college and career ready, and that there are other aspirations that students may have that are beyond just these assessments, and that we might want to think about sort of covering the broader range of coursework that students participate in during their careers. The contrasting point that we heard to that was that might be true, but whether or not the formal accountability system is the right place to acknowledge that course diversity may not be the case. So overall, in terms of the subgroup conversation, people thought it was really hard. I think our next step is really giving people more concrete options to react to, and to be able to see how our schools sort of would fall in a system based on different ways that we could handle subgroups, and what we're ultimately hoping to incentivize in terms of behaviors, while also being really cautious about the potential unintended consequences of how we factor in subgroups to our system. Any questions on that piece? Okay, great. So then I just wanted to take a moment to give you a sense of what's coming up next. So the accountability system is just one piece of our state plan that we're planning to submit next year. Each state is also required to submit a plan that includes other components, which include describing consultation and coordination, challenging academic standards and academic assessments, supporting excellent educators, and supporting all students. So the focus groups that we're having throughout this month focus on both the accountability system as well as these other elements of the state plan. And as I mentioned, there was a session on ELs yesterday. The complete calendar of engagement opportunities is on our website, and you'll see in that document there's also the links to not only the registration for the in-person events, but also for the webinars recapping each in-person meeting. So if you go to our website, ossi.dc.gov/ESSA, you'll see a document that's hyperlinked called ESSA Engagement Opportunities, and that's the best place to find the upcoming events and to see which ones are most aligned to your interests, which ones you're most familiar with, or perhaps which ones you're least familiar with and therefore interested in learning more about. And you can register for the in-person sessions or the webinars through those links. And then our homepage is the best place to look for the notes for the meetings that have taken place. So as I mentioned, the notes from this session will be posted on our website by early next week. And we will continue to advertise upcoming events in the LEA Look Forward as well. Before we conclude today's webinar, are there any follow-up questions from anyone listening in? As a reminder, you can also email questions at any time to us at ossi.essa@dc.gov. And with that, we'll go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining us.